Almost every single ancient culture on the planet shares one specific, terrifying story. From the Epic of Gilgamesh in ancient Mesopotamia, to the biblical story of Noah's Ark, to the ancient Hindu texts of India, and the oral traditions of the indigenous tribes of the Americas and Australia, they all speak of a time when the heavens opened, the oceans rose, and a catastrophic, world-ending flood wiped out humanity. For centuries, modern historians dismissed this as a simple myth, a shared psychological fairy tale. But to a geologist, a myth shared by every culture on Earth isn't a fairy tale. It is a genetic memory. It is a trauma so absolute and so destructive that it was burned into the collective consciousness of the human race and passed down around campfires for 10,000 years. Because the terrifying truth is this: the Great Flood was not a myth. It was a very real, very violent global climate apocalypse, and our ancestors lived through it. Welcome back to our survival series. Today we are going completely down the rabbit hole to answer one of the most bizarre and difficult questions of prehistoric life. How on earth did ancient humans wash themselves when the entire world was frozen solid, and water was your greatest enemy? To understand the scale of this catastrophe, we first have to understand what the Earth looked like 20,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum. The Ice Age wasn't just cold, it was incredibly dry. Because temperatures were so low, the Earth's water cycle was essentially broken. Evaporated ocean water fell as snow, but it never melted. Year after year, century after century, the snow piled up and compacted into titanic continental ice sheets. In North America and Northern Europe, these glaciers were up to 2 miles, or over 3 kilometers, incredibly thick. Because so much of the Earth's water was physically locked up in these massive mountains of ice, global sea levels were drastically lower than they are today. If you stood on a beach 20,000 years ago, the ocean would be 400 feet, or 120 meters, lower. This created a completely different map of the world. You could physically walk from Siberia to Alaska across a massive land bridge called Beringia. You could walk from mainland Europe to Great Britain. Australia and New Guinea were joined into a single massive supercontinent. The coastlines of the world extended dozens, sometimes hundreds of miles further out into the ocean. And because humans are naturally drawn to the coast for easy access to fishing, moderate climates, and rich foraging, the vast majority of the human population lived in these low-lying coastal valleys. They built their settlements, their hunting camps, and their entire civilizations on land that, today, does not exist. They lived in a world that felt permanent, but around 15,000 years ago, the planet's thermostat suddenly broke. Due to subtle shifts in the Earth's orbit and the tilt of its axis, global temperatures began to rise. This period is known as the Birling-Alerud warming. To a modern person, global warming sounds like a slow, gradual process where the sea level creeps up an inch every decade. But the end of the Ice Age was not gradual. It was a chaotic, violent, and explosive era of environmental collapse. When a glacier that is 2 miles thick begins to melt, it doesn't just quietly drip into the ocean. The meltwater forms colossal, supermassive freshwater lakes right on top of the ice, or trapped behind fragile dams made of glacial debris and frozen mud. These were not normal lakes. These were bodies of water the size of modern seas, holding billions of tons of freezing water, suspended hundreds of feet above the surrounding land. And ice is a terrible material for building a dam. One of the most terrifying examples of this was Lake Agassiz in North America. As the massive Laurentide ice sheet melted, it created a freshwater lake larger than all of the modern Great Lakes combined. It was held back by a fragile, cracking wall of ice. Around 8,000 years ago, that ice dam finally structurally failed. Imagine you are a Paleo-Indian hunter gathering food in a river valley. The ground suddenly begins to shake with the force of an intense earthquake, but it isn't an earthquake. A deafening, continuous, thunderous roar fills the air, so loud it vibrates in your teeth. You look toward the horizon, and you see a literal wall of freezing, churning water and jagged ice boulders, hundreds of feet high, moving at highway speeds directly toward you. When the Agassiz ice dam broke, it released a mega flood of unimaginable proportions. It unleashed so much water into the ocean so quickly that it completely disrupted the global ocean currents. This wasn't a flood you could outrun, it was a geological eraser. Entire ecosystems, forests, herds of megafauna, and human tribes were instantly pulverized and washed out to sea. This phenomenon happened repeatedly across the globe. Paleoclimatologists call them meltwater pulses. The most extreme was Meltwater Pulse 1A. During this terrifying window of time, global sea levels didn't rise by a few inches. They surged upward by up to 65 feet, or 20 meters, in a geological blink of an eye. The coastline was moving inland so fast that a human hunting party could leave for a week-long expedition, and when they returned, their entire coastal village, their ancestral hunting grounds, and everything they had ever known would be completely underwater. But the rising sea level was only half of the horror. The melting ice completely destabilized the Earth's crust, leading to underwater catastrophes that spawned apocalyptic mega-tsunamis. Let us look at the tragedy of Doggerland. Today, the North Sea separates Great Britain from Europe, but 10,000 years ago this was Doggerland, a massive, incredibly rich and fertile landmass. It was the absolute heart of Stone Age Europe. It was covered in rolling hills, lush river valleys, thick forests, and massive herds of red deer and wild boar. Thousands of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers lived there. It was a prehistoric paradise. But as the sea levels rose, Doggerland slowly shrank, turning into a low-lying, marshy island. The people living there were already struggling, forced to constantly move their camps as the water relentlessly crept higher. And then, around 6100 BC, the final blow was struck. Off the coast of Norway, the underwater continental shelf had been accumulating millions of tons of glacial sediment for thousands of years. The rising sea temperatures destabilized the frozen methane holding this sediment together. Suddenly, an area of the seafloor the size of Scotland completely collapsed in a catastrophic underwater landslide known as the Storegga Slide. The physics of an underwater landslide of this magnitude are beyond human comprehension. The sudden displacement of billions of tons of water created a mega-tsunami. For the people of Doggerland, the day started like any other. But then, the ocean did something impossible. The water at the beaches began to rapidly recede, sucking backward for miles, exposing flopping fish and the bare ocean floor. For a primitive human who had no concept of a tsunami, this must have seemed like dark magic. Some might have walked out onto the dry seabed, curious. Then, the horizon turned black. A roaring wave, estimated to be up to 20 meters or 65 feet high, moving at hundreds of miles per hour, slammed into the low-lying island. Because Doggerland was so flat, there were no mountains to climb, no high ground to escape to. The wave swept completely across the landmass. The trees were ripped from the ground, the animals were drowned, and every single human being on Doggerland was completely obliterated in a matter of hours. The waters eventually settled, but the land never came back. Doggerland was swallowed by the ocean forever. If you survived the tsunamis and the collapsing ice dams, you still had to face the slow, agonizing torture of the encroaching oceans. The most famous example of this, and the event that many historians believe directly inspired the biblical story of Noah's Ark, is the Black Sea Deluge. Before the end of the Ice Age, the Black Sea was not a sea at all. It was a highly fertile freshwater lake, completely cut off from the Mediterranean Sea by a solid land bridge at the Bosporus Strait. For thousands of years, early farming communities and complex hunter-gatherer societies thrived on its shores. It was a safe haven. But as the global glaciers melted, the Mediterranean Sea was steadily filling up, rising higher and higher against the natural earthen dam of the Bosporus. The pressure of millions of tons of salt water was pushing against the dirt and rock. Finally, around 7,500 years ago, the dam breached. It didn't just leak. The earth gave way, and the Mediterranean Sea violently poured into the Black Sea basin. Geologists estimate that the resulting waterfall was 200 times more powerful than Niagara Falls. It roared with a deafening thunder that could be heard for dozens of miles. Every single day, 10 cubic miles of salt water crashed into the basin. For the people living on the shores of the freshwater lake, the apocalypse had arrived. The water level of the Black Sea began to rise at an absolutely terrifying rate, up to 6 inches a day. That might not sound like much, but on a flat coastal plain, 6 inches of vertical rise means the shoreline is moving inland by as much as a mile every single day. Imagine the sheer psychological terror. You build your house further inland to escape the water. But the next morning the water is at your door again. You move again, exhausted, terrified, and starving. But the water never stops chasing you. It chased them for 300 straight days. Their farms were flooded, Their ancestral graves were swallowed, and the fresh water they relied on to drink was suddenly poisoned with toxic salt water. Tens of thousands of people were forced to flee into the mountains of Europe and Asia, carrying nothing but stories of an angry God who drowned the world. How did humanity survive this era of total global chaos? They survived because the Great Flood forced the ultimate evolutionary leap in human ingenuity. Before the flood, humans were primarily terrestrial apex predators. They relied on tracking massive, slow-moving megafauna on solid ground. But when the massive beasts went extinct, and the land was swallowed by water and deadly bogs, the old rules of survival died. Humanity had to adapt or drown. The trauma of the melting world forced our ancestors to look to the very thing that was destroying them, the water. Out of pure, desperate necessity, the survivors became the first true maritime engineers. They realized that a floating log could hold their weight. They used their stone tools to carve deep, hollowed-out canoes from massive tree trunks, allowing them to navigate the newly flooded forests and swollen rivers. They realized that the ocean, which had just destroyed their homes, was also an infinite source of food. They invented complex bonefish hooks, woven nets, and advanced fish traps. The Great Flood completely rewired human psychology. We learned that the Earth is not a permanent, safe place. We learned that the environment can turn hostile overnight, and that survival requires constant vigilance, movement, and technological adaptation. The tribes that stubbornly stayed on the coastlines, refusing to adapt, were washed away and erased from the genetic pool. The ones who survived were the paranoid, the brilliant, and the highly adaptable. When you look in the mirror today, you are not looking at the descendant of simple, primitive cavemen who just sat around waiting for the world to end. You are looking at the genetic legacy of the ultimate survivors. You carry the blood of the people who watched the sky fall, who outran the mega tsunamis, who built the first boats while the world drowned around them, and who refused to go extinct. The Great Flood wasn't just a story of mass destruction. It was the brutal crucible that forged modern human resilience. They survived the apocalypse so that we could be here today. If this deep dive into the terrifying reality of the Ice Age floods completely changed how you view our ancient history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments below what prehistoric survival nightmare you want me to break down next. Stay safe, stay dry, and I will see you in the next one.